The thunder on Krell 9 didn't roll. It detonated. Every 5 seconds, a 5 billion joule discharge tore the violet sky into jagged ribbons, shaking the very bedrock of the Class 8 Death World. Gemma hit the mud hard. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving her tasting copper and the sulfurous bite of the atmosphere. She rolled, hands scrabbling for purchase on the slick, obsidian-colored silt. Flack, flack. The loose nylon strap of her rucksack slapped against her lower back, a steady, irritating rhythm that matched her pulse. It was the only thing that felt normal in a place where the air tried to melt your skin. She reached into the side pocket, her fingers brushing the cool, familiar glass of a small jar. Table salt. Her father had joked that Krell 9 might be bland. He was wrong about the flavor, but right about the need for a little home-cooked grit. You'll want to hear how that jar changed the fate of 60 people. Trust me, the ending of this survival log is a report the Academy still hasn't figured out how to file. 6 stories above the mud, in the shielded observation deck, Instructor Thran remained motionless. Only the frantic, rhythmic grinding of his dorsal scales betrayed the pressure, a sound like a serrated knife on a wet stone. He gestured to the main screen, where 60 lights flickered like dying embers. The green hell of Krell 9 was doing its work. Statistically, 40 recruits would be unconscious within the hour. The other 20 would likely follow before the twin suns set. Kalmori logic dictated that survival was a matter of energy conservation. But as the first acid rain began to sizzle against the drop pods, Thran's eyes locked onto a single flickering heat signature that refused to dim. The rain started as a fine mist that smelled like burning vinegar. Gemma pulled her hood low, but a stray droplet found the bridge of her nose. It stung like a wasp, a sharp, localized heat that made her wince. She looked at her boots. The seals were holding, but the terrain was a vertical nightmare of jagged basalt and flash-flooding gullies, which meant the survival manual was a work of fiction. The manual suggested finding a cave and waiting for extraction. Gemma looked at the churning gray-green river forming at her feet and shook her head. She hadn't spent 18 years off-grid in the Alaskan bush to die in a hole while a perfectly good gravity-fed water system was being delivered from the sky. In the theater, the grinding of Thran's scales intensified. He tapped a command, bringing human candidate 09 into focus. A junior technician flicked his tongue in confusion at the data. On the main screen, the biometric readout for Gemma was anomalous. Her heart rate was high but steady. Yet her core temperature wasn't dropping. In fact, it was surging. Candidate 09 is failing to enter dormancy, the technician noted, his voice strained. The thermal output is exceeding safety parameters for standard terrestrial life. Thran said nothing, his gaze fixed on the screen. He knew the files. Humans originated from a world with 1,500 active volcanoes. They were conditioned for extreme thermal flux. While other species huddled to preserve warmth, human biology was a walking nuclear reactor wrapped in soft skin. Then the sky fell. A massive electrical discharge struck a nearby basalt spire, sending a shower of molten rock into the valley. Gemma didn't run. She stood there, squinting through the glare, her hand reaching up to shield her eyes. The heat from the blast felt good. Her shivering, which had been a low-level vibration since the drop, stopped completely. She felt a surge of warmth in her chest, a primitive furnace kicking into high gear. As her body processed the atmospheric energy faster, she moved toward the edge of the rushing gully. The acid rain was collecting there, pouring down the slope in a shimmering, deadly cascade. A strange thought struck her. It looked like the slides at the county fair back home, only with more potential for third-degree burns and much better speed. She began to unbuckle her rucksack, her eyes calculating the angle of the slope. "Why isn't she seeking shelter?" the technician asked, his scales vibrating. "The lightning is outputting billions of joules." Thran watched Gemma move. She wasn't fleeing the danger. She was measuring it. He had seen humans before, but never in a Class 8 environment without powered armor. They were supposed to be the soft species. But as he watched her lean over the rushing acid, his internal cooling system struggled to keep up with the vicarious stress. Gemma knelt by the gully. She unscrewed the jar of salt and looked at the white crystals in the heavy, acidic air. They seemed to glow. She wasn't thinking about the Deathworld designation or the Council survival stats. She was thinking about friction coefficients and chemical neutralizers. She took a deep breath of the acrid air and smiled, her teeth bright against the violet gloom. Then she tipped the jar. Behind the basalt ridge, the world ended. At least that was the consensus inside the shielded observation deck, where Instructor Thran watched the monitors with a growing sense of clinical dread. The survival feeds from the other 59 recruits were a symphony of slowing pulses and dropping core temperatures. The Kalmori were built for efficiency, for the slow conservation of heat, but Krell 9 was a predator that didn't allow for patience. Thran's screens flickered as a localized radiation spike hit the valley. On Earth, this kind of solar bombardment was a Tuesday. Candidate 09's internal chemistry is shifting again, the technician whispered, his scales dull with second-hand exhaustion. She isn't just resisting the radiation. She's absorbing it. Thran reviewed the deep scan data from the Academy's archives. Humans, it seemed, had evolved to treat literal solar radiation as a nutritional supplement, a biological trigger for bone-strengthening vitamins. While every other species in the galaxy spent trillions on radiation shielding, humans had spent their history lying on beaches to catch the glow. What kind of predator finds a playground in a lightning storm? Down in the mud, Gemma wasn't thinking about vitamins. The metallic, recycled plastic taste of her last hydration tab lingered on her tongue, a bitter reminder of the sterile Academy cafeteria she'd left behind only 6 hours ago. She needed that bitterness. It kept her grounded while the sky tried to vibrate her teeth out of her skull. She had finished pouring the salt into the pooling gully, watching the white crystals vanish into the murky green acid. The reaction was immediate. The sodium chloride didn't just neutralize the surface acidity. It altered the viscosity of the silt, creating a slick, low-friction slurry that shimmered under the violet lightning. Gemma looked at the steep 200-yard drop that led directly toward the secondary drop zone, where the other recruits were currently freezing to death. She jumped. It worked. While the other 60 recruits huddled in the shadows of the drop pods, their cold-blooded metabolism slowing to a crawl in the face of the Class 8 atmospheric chill, Gemma was busy calculating the sheer kinetic potential of the gravity-fed runoff, viewing the deadly landscape not as a grave, but as a series of fluid dynamic opportunities. She was a blurring streak of orange survival fabric, hurtling down the gully at 40 miles per hour. The neutralized acid sprayed around her like sea foam. She wasn't screaming in terror. She was leaning into the turns, using her heels to steer against the basalt walls. Thran stood up, his scales grinding so loudly the sound echoed off the observation glass. He watched the human collide with the secondary drop zone. She didn't come as a survivor seeking help. She came as a tidal wave. Gemma hit the bottom of the slope, rolling into the soft, salt-crusted silt at the feet of a dozen shivering Kalmori cadets. They looked at her with wide, unblinking eyes, their scales turning a sickly translucent gray from the cold. "Is that supposed to hurt?" Gemma asked, brushing a layer of neutralized acid off her shoulder. She looked back up the glowing, violet-lit slope with a look of genuine disappointment. "Because back home we have to pay $20 for a ride that short. You guys really need to lighten up. The water's fine." 2 cadets shared a look of pure, unadulterated horror. They were watching a creature that had just used a Class 8 extinction event as a waterslide. They quietly vowed, right then and there, never to volunteer for a rotation on any world that shared a border with human space. Thran's display flashed a final red-lettered warning as the electrical storm peaked, outputting a discharge of 5 billion joules. The human didn't flinch. She just stood there, her heat signature burning like a small star in the center of the darkness. The rescue ships arrived 3 hours later. They found all 60 recruits alive, clustered around a massive steaming reservoir Gemma had carved into the rock, using the storm's own runoff to keep them warm. The Academy's final report was brief. It didn't mention the water park of Krell 9 by name. Instead, it reclassified the human species from Tier 4 Sentinel to Tier 1 Environmental Catalyst. 6 months later, the small, empty jar of table salt sat behind a reinforced glass display in the Academy's Great Museum. It wasn't labeled as a flavor enhancer or a mundane kitchen staple. The plaque beneath it simply read, Primary Survival Catalyst. Human Extraction 09. The light from the museum's ceiling caught the few remaining white grains at the bottom, making them sparkle with a cold, sharp brilliance. Under the silence of the vaulted ceiling, the jar sat as a quiet warning to any species that mistook human play for weakness.